Ancient mummy DNA reveals chilling clue to deadly disease that swept the Americas for centuries. Historians have known that smallpox became one of the most devastating forces unleashed upon indigenous populations of the Americas following European contact. But now, scientists have recovered something far more difficult to dispute than historical accounts: genetic evidence of the virus itself. Researchers examining centuries-old human remains in northern Chile have recovered ancient smallpox DNA from mummified individuals who lived during the early period of European colonization. The discovery provides what researchers describe as the strongest direct molecular evidence, yet that smallpox arrived in the Americas as part of European colonial expansion. The findings offer a chilling glimpse into one of the most consequential disease disasters in human history, and demonstrate how modern genetic technology can uncover evidence from people who died more than 400 years ago. A discovery hidden in ancient remains, the research centered on an archaeological site at Camarones in northern Chile. Scientists led by geneticist Shigeaki Nakagome of Trinity College Dublin examined 13 bone samples that had previously been collected from the site. The remains belonged to people who lived during a period of enormous upheaval in South America. European forces had arrived, indigenous societies were facing conquest and political disruption, and diseases previously unknown to many communities were spreading across the hemisphere. Among the samples, researchers discovered evidence of 2 smallpox infections involving a young adult man and woman. The individuals are believed to have died sometime between 1492 and 1631. That dating window is significant. It overlaps the period when Spanish colonial expansion was transforming South America. The discovery therefore places molecular evidence of smallpox directly within the archaeological record of the early colonial era. For historians, archaeologists, and geneticists, the result helps connect 2 lines of evidence that have existed largely separately for centuries: written descriptions of catastrophic epidemics and physical remains of the people who experienced them. Now, researchers can examine the pathogen itself.
Adventure starts with the right gear, and it all starts at shackshop.us. From stylish women's swimsuits and premium camping tents to paddleboards, underwater drones, and dependable dinghies, we have everything you need for your next outdoor adventure. Whether you're exploring the water or relaxing on shore, gear up with quality products at unbeatable prices. Visit shackshop.us today and make every adventure.
That could kill 1 out of 3 before vaccination and modern medicine, smallpox was among humanity's most feared diseases. The disease was caused by the variola virus and could produce fever, exhaustion, and a characteristic rash that developed into painful pustules. Survivors frequently carried permanent scars, and some suffered blindness or other lasting complications. Fox News reports that smallpox killed roughly 1/3 of those infected. That mortality rate made smallpox terrifying even in populations that had lived with the disease for generations. For populations encountering it for the first time, however, the consequences could be even more devastating. Smallpox was not the only infectious disease introduced into the Americas after European contact. Measles, influenza, and other illnesses also contributed to enormous population losses. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian notes that indigenous populations across the Americas experienced catastrophic losses following European contact, with estimates suggesting that Native America lost as much as 95% of its population during the first 130 years after contact. That does not mean smallpox alone caused that entire demographic collapse. Disease interacted with warfare, enslavement, displacement, famine, social disruption, and other consequences of colonization. Historians continue to debate the precise contribution of individual diseases and the methods used to estimate pre-contact population levels. But there is little doubt that epidemics transformed the balance of power. Why the DNA matters. Historical documents have long described smallpox epidemics in the Americas. But historical records have limitations. Many were written by European observers, and descriptions of disease could be incomplete or imprecise. Archaeologists can identify lesions and other physical signs on human remains, but those signs do not always provide definitive proof of the specific disease responsible. Ancient DNA changes the equation. Finding fragments of viral genetic material inside human remains can provide direct molecular evidence that a pathogen infected an individual. That is precisely what makes the Chilean discovery so important. According to Fox News, the researchers found evidence of 2 smallpox infections among the 13 bone samples they examined. The discovery represents the first evidence of smallpox in that particular region of South America. The Associated Press similarly reported that the study provides the strongest scientific evidence to date that European colonization introduced smallpox to the Americas. The discovery does not simply tell scientists that smallpox existed in the Americas. It helps establish when and where the virus was present and allows researchers to compare the ancient virus with other strains from different periods and locations. That creates the possibility of reconstructing the disease's journey across continents. A mystery still remains one of the most intriguing questions is how smallpox traveled from the initial points of European contact to northern Chile. The virus did not need modern transportation. Human beings were enough. Smallpox spreads primarily through close contact between infected people. In a world without antibiotics, antiviral treatments, or vaccination, an infected traveler could potentially introduce the disease into another community. From there, established networks of movement and trade could carry it farther. Researchers have suggested that indigenous trade networks may have played an important role in the spread of smallpox across the Americas. The virus could also have traveled through other populations moving through the hemisphere during the colonial period, including people transported through the Atlantic slave trade. This makes the epidemic difficult to reconstruct. The arrival of Europeans did not create a single, clearly defined moment when smallpox appeared everywhere. Instead, diseases moved through a rapidly changing human landscape. Communities that had never encountered the virus could suddenly find themselves exposed. Survivors might develop immunity, but communities repeatedly struck by epidemics could lose large portions of their populations. The biological advantage was enormous. Smallpox had another characteristic that made its arrival especially devastating. It was an old-world disease. European populations had lived with smallpox for generations. That does not mean Europeans were immune, far from it. Smallpox remained deadly in Europe for centuries. But repeated exposure meant that populations had a longer history of encountering the virus and developing individual and population-level immunity. The situation was different in many indigenous communities of the Americas. The Americas had their own diseases and epidemics before European arrival, but the disease environment was different. As historian Alfred Crosby famously explored in his work on the Columbian Exchange, European arrival brought a large collection of infectious diseases into populations that had not previously experienced them at the same scale. The Smithsonian describes smallpox as one of the Old World infections that spread through the Americas following European contact. The result was not simply a medical crisis. It was a social catastrophe. When large numbers of people became sick or died, communities lost parents, children, farmers, hunters, political leaders, religious figures, and skilled workers. Governments could become destabilized. Armies could weaken. Food production could collapse. And societies already facing military pressure could find themselves fighting an enemy they could not see. Did disease help conquer the Americas? The answer is complicated, but disease clearly played an enormous role. European armies were often dramatically smaller than the indigenous forces and populations they encountered. Yet Spanish conquistadors were able to defeat powerful civilizations. Disease was one factor that changed those calculations. The Smithsonian's discussion of the Columbian Exchange notes that epidemics such as smallpox devastated indigenous populations in areas including Mexico and Peru, contributing to the extraordinary circumstances that allowed relatively small numbers of Spanish invaders to confront enormous indigenous civilizations. That does not mean Europeans simply won because of germs. Military technology, alliances, political divisions, strategy, economic exploitation, and other factors were also critical. But disease could weaken a society before or during military conflict. A population devastated by an epidemic cannot easily mobilize soldiers, maintain food supplies, or preserve political stability. The effect could become a vicious cycle. Disease weakened communities became more vulnerable to conquest, and conquest created conditions that could further accelerate displacement and disease. An important warning about the word bioweapon. The history of smallpox in the Americas sometimes generates sensational claims that Europeans deliberately used the disease as a biological weapon. The new DNA evidence does not establish that. Researchers can identify the pathogen and study its genetic history. They cannot automatically determine the intentions of the people who carried it. The evidence currently supports the conclusion that smallpox was introduced during the period of European colonization. It does not prove that the particular infections discovered in Chile were deliberately caused. That distinction matters. Disease can be devastating without anyone intentionally deploying it. In fact, one of the most frightening aspects of the story is precisely how little human planning was required for an epidemic to become catastrophic. A contagious virus entering a population without prior exposure could accomplish enormous damage through ordinary transmission. Smallpox eventually became the first human disease eradicated. There is an extraordinary final chapter to the story. The same disease that once devastated populations across continents was ultimately eliminated from natural circulation. Vaccination transformed the fight against smallpox. The global eradication campaign eventually succeeded, and the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated in 1980. Today, smallpox no longer naturally circulates among human populations. That makes the Chilean discovery even more remarkable. The virus that once terrified entire civilizations has become a historical object that scientists can study through fragments preserved in ancient remains. Instead of examining a living epidemic, researchers are reconstructing one from the molecular evidence left behind. The mummies are more than archaeological artifacts. The two individuals discovered through the genetic research were not simply containers for ancient DNA. They were people. One was a young woman approximately 30 to 35 years old. The other was a young man approximately 18 to 20 years old, according to reporting on the research. Their remains survived for centuries. Their names are unknown. Their voices are gone. But their DNA has now provided scientists with information about a disease that shaped the history of an entire hemisphere. That is one of the extraordinary powers of modern archaeology. A skeleton can tell researchers about age, diet, and injuries. Ancient DNA can reveal ancestry and relationships. Pathogen DNA can sometimes tell researchers what diseases affected people hundreds or thousands of years ago. In this case, it has also helped answer a historical question that has been debated for generations. A new window into an old catastrophe. The discovery does not rewrite everything historians already knew about smallpox. Instead, it strengthens a critical piece of the historical record. For generations, historians have relied on documents, archaeological evidence, and demographic estimates to understand the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations. Now, scientists have molecular evidence from the victims themselves. That evidence helps establish that smallpox was present in northern Chile during the early colonial period, and provides another clue to how the virus evolved and spread. But perhaps the most important lesson is that history is not finished. Every archaeological site contains the possibility of new discoveries. Every fragment of bone may contain biological information that scientists decades ago could never have recovered. And as DNA technology improves, researchers may eventually identify additional ancient pathogens and reconstruct their movements across the Americas with unprecedented detail. The Chilean mummies have already provided a chilling clue. A disease that once swept across the Americas left behind more than scars in historical memory. It left a genetic signature. And more than 400 years later, scientists have finally been able to read it.